So, we are going to start off with Ashok talking a little bit about the book. He'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we've got 4 discussants, David Harvey, Tithi Bhattarcharya, Catarina Principe, and Marina Vishmidt. They're going to speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to questions. So, Ashok, if you want to just get to it.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Tithi and David and Catarina and Marina for discussing the book. And this is the book isn't out yet, so this is a bit of like a taster. I don't know what that means. It just means that, like, if you like it, then you're like, I want to eat the whole book. Or you're like, oh, this is disgusting. I don't want any more of this. So hopefully you like it. The first question I get when I tell people the name of the book is, they're like, what's monopsony? And then after that, they're like, why would you call your book that? And then they're like, are your publishers crazy? Why would they let you do that? And then I go, look, monopsony, and the argument I make is that it's central to understanding global industrial capitalism and how value is distributed. And I'm mostly interested in how value is distributed, so if there's any questions about how value is produced, I'm not really that interested in it. For the purpose of the book. In general, sure, but not for the purpose of the book. I propose a kind of universal logic, let's call it a tendency, which gives me a little bit of an out in case I get, stuck in a corner. That's driven by the degree of monopsony power, which governs competition, reshapes the value chain, and ultimately determines the possibilities for workers' bargaining. I focus on the garment and footwear sectors, which have come to symbolize sort of sweatshops and its durability throughout time, or at least for the last 100 years. Monopsony is best understood as a kind of inverse for the purposes of this, as an inverse of monopoly. Monopoly, as many of you know, is a kind of horizontal relationship. Monopsony is best seen as a vertical relationship. Monopoly, a single seller, or a degree of monopoly that tells us it's monopoly power or oligopoly. Conversely, monopsony is a single buyer and many sellers. So degree of monopsony tells us those ratios. I apply this principle, which has become popular in sort of labor market analysis, to the value chain, to understand the value chain. Secondly, sweatshops. I know there's a lot of people who define sweatshops. The definition usually it's a kind of affective definition that evokes a kind of, sweated labor and cramped conditions. I define it, and you kind of know it when you see it, right? But I define it as best understood as industrial labor with little to no, but very little bargaining power. So this is from Rana Plaza. The book begins at Rana Plaza. Many people are aware of this. This was in Dhaka in 2013. 1,134, mostly women, were crushed to death in one of the worst industrial accidents in history. I trace it back 100 years to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factories to sort of understand the dynamics, what's made the sweatshop so durable, but also what are the changing dynamics in it, and try to understand it at a theoretical level. So people are familiar with this, but as a kind of quick recap, these sweat sectors are marked by sort of low value. That means there's a low level of value capture at the point of production. That's because it's vertically disintegrated, so it's always been vertically disintegrated. So buyers are different from suppliers, and that's allowed for downward pressure. This has meant that it's low technology at the point of production, and it's known as buyer-driven. That means the buyers that determine are the power brokers in the value chain. Buyers meaning brands and retailers. So as a sort of illustrative example, let's say you take 2 sets of photos, one in the beginning of the 20th century and one at the end of the 20th century, one from the auto sector and one from the garment sector. In the auto sector, at the beginning of the 20th century, you'll have mostly men who are working on a assembly line, and there's not that much machinery. By the end of the 20th century, if you look at it, you can Google image this, you'll have basically machinery everywhere and very few humans working there. Whereas in the garment sector, at the turn of the 20th century and the turn of the 21st century, it's basically women crouched over sewing machines. So it's very low organic composition. There's been very little investment at the point of production, which means that there's low barriers to entry. So again, the existing theory tells us that brand companies and retailers maximize profits by creating bidding wars between suppliers. Factory owners or suppliers, in order to stay competitive, increase downward pressure on workers. Workers on the factory floor are left with poverty wages, deteriorating workplaces, and increased incidence of factory fires and collapse. Suppliers who are unable to reach the price demands of buyers risk loss of order or closure. This dependence has historically left suppliers in a perpetual state of instability, unable to muster the capital necessary to escape the orbit of brand power and pursue their own development. So this means that the sector has relied largely on a spatial fix, as Harvey has introduced, rather than a technological or organizational fix. And what we see is a kind of inverse relationship between the technological and organizational fix. The more you invest in the technology, the more limits you have on the spatial possibilities for transnational capital. So, again, a case in point in drawing the distinction between monopoly and monopsony is you look at, say, auto sector. 130 years ago, 100 years ago, you might have had 100 car factories, producers of cars. By the mid-century, you had about 10, and that means that those are sort of monopolistic firms because the suppliers are also the ones that are selling the product. So you have the big companies like GM, Ford, etc. It's vertically integrated. You walk into a Nike shop, or a shop that sells a pair of Nikes, you could rest assured that about 99% of the entire production process has not been owned directly by Nike. So from warehousing, logistics to production, etc. They only own the brand. So what that means, because of low barriers to entry, the supply chain is shaped like a bottleneck. So you have lots of different suppliers, very few buyers, and so they can determine through the bottleneck to put price pressure downwards. And so basically what that means is, imagine you're an emerging capitalist in Cambodia or India, and you want to open up a transnational firm. If you want to open up a garment factory that's export oriented, it might cost you £1 million. There's 3,000 workers because the organic composition is very low. Whereas if you want to open up an auto factory, it might cost you 100 million. If you want to open up an aeronautics plant, it might cost you $1 billion. That means there's every time you have a form of deregulation, the number of suppliers grows, which increases the degree of monopsony power, right? I look at for the sector, I look at the least valorizable sections of the sector. So the ones that are least fashion sensitive, least seasonal, as kind of indicators. The garment sector is what you'd call a starter sector. It's the first to come and the first to go in the developmental process. And so what that means is that it tells us where, it's a kind of canary in the coal mine. It tells us where capitalism is headed, which direction it's going in. So I look at the indicators of an indicator to tell us more about the sector. So what I propose is a kind of changing dynamic. And it's as follows. I introduce this universal logic, and it's something I'm working on more broadly in building sort of economic models with Yorgos Galanis in Goldsmiths, is that firstly, that this is what it's proposed, and it's laid out more in detail, obviously, in the book, but that firstly, deregulation produces high degrees of monopsony power. That this increases the value share to the lead firm, in this case, the buyer. So in general, whenever the degree of monopsony power goes higher, the share of value captured by the buyers also increases, and vice versa, right? This intensifies competition, which exerts downward pressure on the value chain, winnowing the number of suppliers. So as the competition increases and degree of monopsony power goes higher, source prices go lower, and it winnows the number of suppliers, which shrinks the degree of monopsony power. Falling degrees of monopsony power leads to consolidation, so mergers and acquisition, which increases the value share captured by the supplier, which increases self-investment, and self-investment in the form of organization, horizontal and vertical integration, and investment in labor-saving technology, which increases the barrier to entry. So now, in these most valorizable sectors, imagine you're this Cambodian or Indian emerging capitalist. It might not cost you 100 million, it might cost you 150 million, and so on and so forth. So in the case of the garment sector, what we see is once deregulation sets in, so 2005 was the end of what we call the MFA, the multi-fiber agreement. It was a 30-year agreement, quota systems, which required brands to basically produce in the far-flung corners of the globe. They start consolidating, so the degree of monopsony power goes up in a handful of labor-rich countries, Vietnam, China, mostly India, etc. As that happens, it's consolidating in fewer and fewer countries, and then it's consolidating in fewer and fewer hands because of this dynamic, right? Because we have downward pressure. The profits of these companies increases exponentially post-2005 to 2008. 2009, you start seeing it kind of balance out. And what that means is you have increased consolidation at the point of production and consolidation. And as that happens, the degree of monopsony falls. And so then you have, from a buyer-driven supply chain, it's moving towards a more symbiotic relationship. But it's not. It's still buyer-driven. But so, I tried to demystify this for a little bit. to make more sense of it, let's say it comes from labor market analysis. So let's say we're all workers, right? We're all workers in this room, but I'm using suppliers as workers, and there's one employer. Let's say Rob is the employer, and Rob is a monopolistic employer.
I really am.
The only way, and we're imagining the only way that we could, survive, our only means of subsistence is by selling our labor power to Rob. But Rob only has about 2 jobs. Then all of us will basically competing in order to get those 2 jobs. That means there's a high degree of monopoly power. That gives Rob an incredible amount of power. So those 2 people get the job for nothing, for like peanuts. And as that happens, we're all starving, and soon we all start dying. We start starving to death. As that happens, the degree of monopoly power starts falling because there's fewer and fewer people able to compete. As that happens, the amount of bargaining power that the remaining surviving firms or surviving people have vis-a-vis Rob increases, and the share of value becomes more distributed. What this means for the value chain, what this means for workers, is that between 2030 and 2070, between 1930 and 1970, what you had is a form of what I argue is a regulatory spatial inflexibility. If spatial flexibility was a way for transnational capital or the buyers to maximize profits, spatial inflexibility puts limits on those on the ability to increase its surplus value, extract that surplus value at the point of consumption, and put downward pressure on workers ultimately. What that did was, what you saw was that you saw increased wages to the garment sector until basically in 1940. You had garment workers in America were making as much as auto workers. The reason for that, because of the regulatory spatial inflexibility brought on by a certain degree of regulation, but also limits on where capital could go. So that put limits on the degree of monopsony power. You also had a very vibrant union in the ILGWU. But then you had spatial, after the end of the regime of spatial inflexibility, basically by 2005, 2006, 2007, you have what I'm arguing is a kind of a regime of market spatial inflexibility. Because of consolidation, because of investment in labor-saving technology, because of the sunk cost increase, which makes it possible for workers to make greater demands at the point of production, because you now have more value-laden suppliers, but also the ability for them to move around is there's more limits on their ability to move around. How much time do I have?
You have got
8 minutes.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Plenty of time. So, I traced back to 100 years ago, where you had, the ILGW was able to. This is an International Lady Garments Workers Union based in New York. Was able to make demands at both the point of production, this is after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in the 1920s and 30s. They made demand at the point of production, so the manufacturer, and they made demands at the point of consumption, so jobbers is what they called them then, but we can see them as brands and retailers. And they forced them, it was 3-part contract, they forced them to make deals with a designated list of union suppliers. What they did is it put limits on the degree of monopsony power that these suppliers have, and they forced them to ring fence, so increase the amount of value that was distributed at the point of production, in order for it to actually be distributed to the worker. We see that. What I'm arguing is the reason why. This is a Life magazine piece from 1938, where they basically these are garment workers. Where they're showing that their benefits and their wages were at the level of auto workers. Unheard of, right? But the problem was with that 3-part structure remained intact. They didn't undermine the 3-part structure. They just worked within the 3-part structure. So then once it starts getting globalized, the union basically can't outrun, capital. Really quickly, this is the 2014 strike at UUN facility. It was the largest strike of a private sector firm in China. There were 50,000 workers who struck over social insurance. 1 in 6 shoes in this room were probably produced at a UUN facility. It didn't really exist. It was amongst thousands of suppliers, 15, 20 years ago. And so what happened was that what we can see, and this is kind of like, Lukács says that it's only at the points of rupture that you can really understand capital in its totality. what I'm looking at is a number of different strikes and workplace actions in order to understand how capital reacts. So what we see is that brands didn't cut and run. Historically, when there would be labor actions in the sector, brands would just be like, go to the next cheapest factory. We know this, it's a race to the bottom. Here, brands stayed there because of capacity, because of economies of scale. They weren't able to move. And ultimately, the workers didn't get everything they wanted, but they won 27 million in concessions, and it cost them an additional 31 million because of the strike. But basically, the argument is that Nike and Adidas need UUN as much as almost as much as UUN needs Nike. The same strike happens 6 months later at the same UUN facility in Ho Chi Minh. It's the 90,000 workers. It was the longest strike that have happened in China of a private sector employer, and the state capitulated basically to all their demands. This is an Arvind warehouse that I was observing from 2012 to 2015. This is the Garment and Textile Workers Union in a small, dusty town called Ramnagara. They had a protracted struggle of an Arvind facility. They're the third largest denim manufacturer. Again, 20 years ago, there were thousands of denim manufacturers. Now they've consolidated and vertically integrated because of the logic that I outlined earlier. Ultimately, what we found was that capital didn't basically, the book begins with, I was a translator for an organization in Karnataka. Well, it was a global organization. And I was brought in at the struggle and was listening to the various interviews. And Philip Van Housen, which is the largest shirt manufacturer in the world, what is the main contractor with Arvind. And I come into the room understanding that there's this very asymmetrical relationship between the buyers and brands and retailers and suppliers. And what I saw in the room was actually the PVH representative was quite timid, and the Arvind executives were like, they just didn't care. And I was like, this is really surprising. And I spoke to the investigator on the way back to Bangalore, and he said, this is basically what I've been seeing over the last 5-6 years. So I was like, okay, that's where it began. So basically what we saw here is Arvind that never cuts and runs. But the ability for them, it was ultimately a loss because the firm, Arvind, was capturing so much value at the point of production, they were able to bring in expensive interstate workers. They were able to absorb strike action and labor and slowdowns, etc. So it's not just that you have more capital value captured at the point of production, and that means workers can have greater bargaining power. The possibilities exist, but then it also means that capital can undermine the ability for workers to organize, and that's certainly the case with Arvind. This is Fruit of the Loom supply chain, Jersey State, Honduras, 2013. It was basically a struggle that happened between 2008 and 2013. The company actually vertically integrates. Well, they were moving in that direction, but they vertically integrate because they have low fashion sensitivity, and it made sense for them to, after they vertically integrated, the ability for workers to make demand increases. And so they were able to, get union recognition, and then basically it's the largest private employer in Honduras. They get recognition. They get about 17% higher wages than anyone in the sector in the region, and they're the only really union, other than one factory, Cookdung in Mexico, in the world in export-oriented garments, and that's because it was vertically integrated, and it was vertically integrated because of the logics I outlined earlier. So, in my last few minutes, just to reiterate, the sweatshop sectors relied historically on a kind of inoculation of the technological fix and the organizational fix, and now you're seeing, because of the logics outlined earlier, because of the downward pressure, you're actually seeing increases in the technological and organizational fix, which are putting limits on the spatial fix. This is, and basically what you are seeing now is that you're seeing oligopolies at both ends of the supply chain. So it's moving from a buyer-driven supply chain to a more symbiotic relationship. And this isn't saying that capital isn't going to find other ways. I mean, for example, Adidas, Nike a few years ago announced sort of fully automated firms in Germany and France and England. And that's, I think, a natural response to having these large integrated suppliers that for the short term means that you have quick turnaround times and increased profits, but over a long period, actually decrease those profits and actually increase the liabilities on the lead firm. Thanks.
Okay, everyone, we're going to move next door to the DLT because it's more roomy and less likely to kill us from heat exhaustion. So if we just get up and go next door and sit down, we'll be able to as fast as possible. I got the word from on high, you know.
Oh, right.
Jazz.
Oh, amazing.
I'm not happy with this facial face.
Oh, right. I'm like, in my head, I'm like...
That was very good, sorry.
Oh, thank you very much.
That was great. I learned so much. It was just under 2 minutes, so
Stop, don't.
90 minutes and 50 seconds.
I know, but I'm the person that's doing the timing as chair.
I'm doing timing. Timing.
It's pretty.
You're an employer.
If I forget everything, I'm going to blame you.
Take this.
Oh, no, that's not mine.
Tithi, I'm just literally doing what I've been told to
I
do.
know. You're the employer, remember?
Yeah.
But as Ashok has told us, employers have less power than...
Huh? What's it? Do I look like I'm that sleepy?
No,
Okay, good.
well rested.
Thanks. We did. I do, yeah. At the
Bulgaria is one of the biggest such destinations in this area.
I thought it was Moldova.
Compare. I want to have this facility.
Ooh.
That's kind of a
Very important because it's really
Oh, I love
we
that.
have 150,000 people.
Amazing. I was supposed to come to your talk in Athens.
For boss, people's boss, like big
Really? Oh, wow. Well, I'd love that. Yes? Of course. Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, seems so interesting that
Ooh, ooh. Yeah, you work with them closely, right? With Lauren and stuff?
Well, the Belgrade office.
Oh, thanks. Hey. Hey, how you doing?
I'll send you an email on that.
Okay, yes, please.
It's really interesting.
Thank you very much. I'm so distracted. I'm so sorry. Can we talk about this other? I appreciate it. I know. Tragic. Thanks, bro. Catarina, don't be too harsh. Don't be too harsh. Just check. Do you have a plan? Yeah? Amazing. Oh, yeah, that's it. All right.
There's the chairs.
Pretty efficient.
I thought it would take longer.
It's only been 23 minutes. It basically took like...
3 minutes. All right. Shall we move on quickly?
So David speaking first. I'm gonna have to ask you when timing. You're gonna have to pass these stuff down to me, and then
Huh?
with timing, pass this stuff down to me and pass it back afterwards.
Okay.
Because it'd be hard to get some people's attention. Right, I'm gonna start again.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, thanks for such an efficient move there. We're proving that the left can actually do something cohesively for once in our existence. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the discussants, and up first will be David Harvey responding. So, take it away, David.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. I've actually read most of the book, and it's a very interesting read and extremely helpful. I've long been sort of thinking theoretically about the general problem of where value is produced and how surplus value is produced and where it's realized and where it's appropriated and how things get moved around. And I think the framework that is set up here is a very good way to look at that question. And I really appreciated the detail in which you looked at, particularly the 3 case studies. I think was terrific comparison between China, India, and Honduras, and with a lot of sideways glances at what's going on in other parts of the world. So in this sphere, I think what we're looking at is a reorganization of that sphere. And I think again one of the contributions you make is to say, well, when the multi-fiber agreement collapses or gets discarded, then that actually allows for all kinds of shifts to occur. And the dynamics of these shifts, and I think the increasing centralization of capital at the producer end of this, and its challenge to monopsony power and what that does in terms of the capacities of workers to do the classic thing of factory labor, which is to sort of start to get class conscious and organize and so on. This shift is something which is potentially of great significance globally, and I think it's I very much appreciate what you've done in that regard. I don't like the title. I hate adjectival capitalisms. And if we had more adjectival capitalisms, then God help us. Why don't we just talk about capitalism and capital? So that I have a problem. I think the other issue a little bit was that you situated yourself very much in relationship to all of this discussion that began in the 1990s, where you have all these acronyms. And there were times when I had so many acronyms on a page, I'm saying, I don't know where the fuck I am. And I'd have to go back and find out, what is this? And so are you working with a global value chain or global
Supply chain?
Commodity chain, or are you working with the global production network? In other words, people have tried to put terms on this, as if somehow or other that tells you what's going on. I have a fantastic idea what's going on from your actual account, and I could do without the terms. And I think that you might have been much more critical of some of the ways in which this has been approached, because I think some of the ways this has been approached has actually been to obfuscate the Marxist core of what you're doing. And I think that you could have done a much better job of really pulling out the Marxist. This is my one line of argument, but otherwise I find it as a fantastically informative book. The detail is incredible. I think you've done an amazing job. So that part is great. And just don't make me read another of those pages where it's full of so many acronyms. I don't know what's going on.
So then, who would go next?
Me?
Yep.
Okay. Right. So thanks for this, Ashok. And I had to scroll back and forth on that DMP and so on as well. So I want to talk about. I guess the reason I've been invited on this panel is because the role gender plays in the sweatshop industry, okay? So this is, I actually interviewed many women who were going to later go on to work at Rana Plaza, and I lost these women comrades in the fire, but I interviewed them in 2003. In Dhaka, and one of the amazing things that you'll find if you walk or drive down the streets of Dhaka is how singularly gendered street life is. It's only men all around you, okay? So lots of men around the streets of Dhaka. And the first 3 days. So my parents are from Bangladesh, so we are refugees in India. So this was going back to my parents' city. So I kept thinking, where are all the women? And then I found out at 3 in the morning, if you walk the streets of Dhaka, streams of women, often hijabi but often not, just absolutely crowding the public transports of Dhaka, all going to work at what they self-identify as garment, okay, which is the garment industry. One of the things I found about when I was interviewing women there, what brought me there was a small organizing initiative that was going on, and so I went over to talk to some of these women. But one of the things we found out, for instance, that when and this is the period that I guess Ashok was talking about, when the producers, on the local producers, the local bosses, would cut costs to such an extent that when the sort of European side of things demanded that you have to have a certain kind of workplace regulation, right? So one of the things that they demanded that these local producers, local bosses have is a childcare position, because this is almost 85 to 90% of the working population of the sweatshops are women. So what are these women going to do with their kids, right? So the supplier, Nike or Gap or whoever would say, you need to have a space in the childcare whatever. And I worked with the same person that Ashok worked with, who was the investigator, and he and I went down and looked for it, and in the place where there should have been a childcare unit was a transformer. Okay, so in other words, the local bosses felt absolutely no need, as it were, to organize the workspace in accordance to even like what Gap was saying or what have you. So I think what Ashok calls here a calcified symbiosis is a very important, I found a very important phrase that for the short term anyway, the power of the local bosses increase the power or potential of local organizing on the shop floor, because value is being captured there, that actually this increases the possibility. And this is where I think the second point that Ashok makes in the book becomes very, very important, which is that discipline is an absolute essential tool. Labor discipline is an essential tool for the bosses in the workplace. Okay, because without labor discipline, the entire operation is what he calls, and I quote, an existential threat for producers. Okay, now what is labor discipline in this context? Most of you can guess. Labor discipline is braided intimately with sexual discipline, okay? So this is a very common phenomenon throughout what Ashok and others have looked at, the sweatshop sort of belts in both, the South and Southeast Asia, but also Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, which is, by the way, called, the maquiladoras are called the femicide capital of the Americas, right? So labor, how does labor discipline and sexual discipline work so intimately? Women are, first of all, why do we employ women? We employ women because they are easily manageable. This is the rhetoric across the industry, okay? And strip searches, sexual job favors linked to sexual favors, despite the threat of HIV, is very common. So, for instance, Kenya, there's a very high risk of HIV in this industry, but managers often say, you know, you will get this job only if you sleep with me, okay? So this is very common. Women are strip searched as they leave the jobs, you know, if you're pregnant, you're fired, and so on. So these are various ways in which gender discipline, sexual violence, and labor discipline are braided, especially in this sweatshop industry. And what does this mean in terms of what effects it has in society? Because it has a ripple effect, right? If this is something you get away with in establishing a gender norm, okay, if this becomes a normative in the sphere of production, then this can be a normative in other parts of the social whole, right? So this is a very important, even though the sector is small, it has a ripple effect on the on global gender in general. So that, I think, is very important in shaping notions of femininity and masculinity, and this is where Ashok's point that at least in the short term, the organizing possibilities of this sector increasing is good news, not just for the labor movement, but also for the feminist movement as a whole, okay? So this puts back, in a way, not just a questioning of capital's capacities of exploitation, but also the relations of oppression that are the preconditions for the for the relations of or the forms of exploitation. The third point I want to make about the book, and that's my last point, is what I really appreciated about Ashok's book is the absolute clear argument against ethical organizing from above, okay, what I call ethical organizing from above. So the idea that things are bad in Cambodia or Bangladesh, okay, did allow a really robust student movement to arise in North America, okay. One of its centers was in Wisconsin-Madison, and I'd been in touch with these people and actually advised many of them on my campus as faculty advisors, and they were great. They were absolutely fantastic. And it had some ripple effects on the industry. But what Ashok is showing is the absolute structural limits of that kind of political organizing, which is trying to win the hearts and minds of the consumers in order to make a difference to the industry, okay? Instead of this ethical organizing from above, which is raising awareness, as it were, Ashok's proposal is a robust anti-capitalist organizing from below, which will unite both the workplace, where the workers themselves are organizing, but also because of the gender seam of this struggle, it can organize communities as a whole as well as society as a whole. So thank you, Ashok, for this book.
Okay, next speaker is Catarina.
Okay, hi. So I want to start by telling you the story. I told Ashok I was going to say this. Tell you the story why I'm sitting here. So in May at AGM Athens, we actually had a really nice conversation for some hours. None of us remembers about what. But after this, he invited me to be here. And I asked him why. You know, Tithi just said she understood that she wanted to, her presentation should be something around gender, but I had no idea why he invited me to be here. So I asked him, so why, you know, what do you want from me? And he said, I have no clue. So I feel like I sort of have like a carte blanche to say whatever I want, but I won't be too hard on you. I want to make a short resume of the book. I know Ashok already do it, but bear with me because I think it's important for what I want to say in the end. So Ashok is proposing a dynamic, and focus on dynamic, logic to, quote, global value chains based on the degree of monopsony power, which is reflected in the bargaining power of workers, end quote. So basically what he's arguing is that the changes in the organization of production through the reorganization of the relations between buyers and sellers, it is, quote, as increasingly calcified symbiosis, locking in global buyers with global suppliers, intensifying the integration of supplier and capital, horizontally as factories grow larger, and vertically from factory to warehousing and logistics to retail. Increased access to finance, it is reinvested into labor-saving technology, catalyzing the erecting of unsurmountable barriers to entry, which still reinforces their market position. So greater value capture at the bottom of the global supply chain closes the historical and geographical gap between spaces of value capture and value creation, end quote. So he goes on by developing the categories of higher and lower degree of monopsony power and the changes in global value chains and how the concept of the spatial fix as a means for capital to both avoid crisis or run away from pressures from labor does not happen in the same way today. If the degree of monopsony power falls, the degree of spatial flexibility falls with it. So in this, and in some, it heightens the possibilities, and I want to stress the word possibility, as Ashok does, of workers to bargain with their employers. However, I think the particularity of this book is that it is written from the perspective of the gravediggers. So the book develops by giving examples of in-depth case studies of labor struggles in China, in India, and Honduras in a way of depicting the argument that the changes in global value chains give workers a new room of maneuvering. In that sense, Ashok picks a side and discusses different strategies for the labor movement. Tithi already said something about it. And discusses their strengths and fragilities over mainly the last century, if we look at it all together. He develops, for example, on the example, and he already said something about it, of the ILGW, Jobbers Agreement tactic, as an example of regulatory spatial inflexibility. He discusses the limits of campaigns that target consume with no organic relation with the struggles of workers on the floor, what Tithi just stressed out as well, but nonetheless explores ideas and shows some light at the end of the tunnel of globalized capital for struggling workers. The way in which he writes the book, because it is a book on political economy, from the perspective of the workers, of the gravediggers, with no deterministic shortcuts, and I think he stresses that out, and I want to stress that out as well, makes it clearly a book of someone who is engaged in the struggles, but also a book on strategy. And as he puts it, quote, this book's subject looks at the material with which the sector most associated the sweatshops, the garment and footwear industries, and specifically their export-oriented production. So the title is an observation of a tendency, but also a question, pursued by through in-depth cases and analysis of broader trends. I begin, he says, answering the question by looking at the sector itself and the history of the sweatshop within it, and then proceed to describe its modern phase in the globalized age. Reaction to this new transnational economic epoch have been mixed. Some are giddy at the prospect of a new global working class and insist every third world labor campaign signals either the emergence of a Polanyian double movement or the expanding army of Marxist capitalism gravediggers. Others despair at the concomitant destruction of first world unions and introduction of the third world to the immiseration that unions were conceived to mitigate. And others, I guess like us, are still ambivalent or holding their breath while anticipating the dialectical synthesis, end quote. So we might just be able to breathe again because actually this book is a sort of a proposal to resolve a little bit this dialectical synthesis. But I think no book presentation, in my opinion, is full without its due level of critique. So I want to present mine. So throughout the book, Ashok reflects on the role that states play in framing the rules for international trade and capital accumulation. In the there is even a subchapter on globalization and the state, and in that chapter, Ashok reflects on the processes of internationalization of the state drawing on Poulantzas or Panitch or Ginden, regarding the state as central on the making of globalizations. So states supply the infrastructure upon which global markets depend, while capital depends on states, and, quote, maintaining property rights, overseeing contracts, stabilizing currencies, reproducing class relations, and containing crises. Ashok describes even, so end quote, sorry. Ashok describes as well states as key enablers of the relations between global buyers and producers, and reflects briefly on the different roles that different states had in the concrete examples of struggles that he describes. So either states used their forceful power to stop strikes, or they decided not to intervene, which I think is in itself a form of intervention, or they even intervene in favor of labor in the short term, but actually in the favor of capital in the long run. But although these reflections are present, I think they're left a little bit under-theorized in the strategic proposal that I believe the book aims at. So although I agree that there is only so much reform a capitalist state can take, and that its relative autonomy is really only that, relative, nonetheless, if we agree that capitalism, no matter how globalized it is, exists with, through, and based upon states, it is hard to live this dimension out. So what this means is that a strategy for labor to assert and even maintain its gains cannot be delinked from a strategical thinking about state power. In this sense, I feel that the book is lacking this sort of intermediate level between the struggles at the point of productions and the changes in the organization and flows of transnationalized capital. And although any form of pro-labor policies cannot be fully accomplished without an organized and struggling working class, an organized working class cannot see its victories fully effectivized without changing the state's laws and infrastructures that capital rests upon. So, just two questions. European experience of the welfare state that you actually talk about is the crystallization of a specific relation of forces between capital and labor in a given historical moment. However, it also happened through, at the time, pro-labor parties capable of winning state power. How can we think about this experience without thinking about this dimension of state power? And the other question I have is it possible to say, or is it even fair or correct to say, that a part of the delocalization of garment production industries from Central and South America to Asia happens concurrently to the pink tide, at least a part of it? So is there any political meaning, so meaning that the political unrest and some pro-labor parties that won governments forced a delocalization of capital? It's a question, I don't know. So to end, in a way, states are the framing in which the spatially distinct processes of value production and capture occur. They sort of bridge that gap. And if it is so, with all the limitations that a capitalist state intrinsically possesses, and I don't think we can formulate a strategic vision for labor without addressing the question of state power. The degree in which labor can use the state, and how much and how capital forces can recapture the state, and what we would need to resolve this tension, is what I find structural in any form of strategic thinking today. But don't take me wrong, okay? Ashok's book is still really interesting, really important, and really seminal. He asked me to say that. Even if he has this little circumvention. But I think that this dialectical synthesis and the resolution of this dialectical synthesis that is not present, we need it if we don't want to hold our breaths any longer. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me onto this panel, Ashok. And I think I'll return the favor by also asking a few questions, which might not be so surprising as You didn't ask me to take part in this discussion as an expert in the field, where the book situates its inquiry, but rather for a perspective of the value element, which you discuss through the global value chain. On this, I'm also not sure I have a terrifically erudite or original set of theses to contribute, so hopefully the questions will be useful. So a central concept, again, like everyone else, I'm going to do some summarizing. A central concept of this book is monopsony, the situation of concentration of power and value capture with one or few buyers and many suppliers, a company town or single industry-like model, essentially. What you chart is a shift in the relations of monopsony, so the DMP, degree of monopsony power, is seen to shift from the transnational brands and in favor of garment factories located in the so-called Global South post-2005 and the end of the globally promulgated multi-fiber agreement framework. The contention that Ashok makes on the basis of this shift is there has also been an observable shift of power in the workers' favor potentially, as garment factories lock buyers in by becoming bigger, more vertically integrated, able to offer more developed production technology and diversified products, sometimes even branching out into their own brand development and retail ventures, as with Arvind in India. While low integration, low margin sweatshop style production allegedly lent a competitive advantage to the outsourcing of garment production by Western brands to the Global South, the expiration of the multi-fiber agreement saw a less regulated market which favored consolidation. Brands find it much more difficult and non-cost effective to switch suppliers at will, which is what disaggregated the sector in the past, once factories become one-stop shops, fulfilling all their needs. Thus, bigger and more stable manufacturing environments even the balance between sellers and buyers, factories and brands, leaving the sweatshop model behind as profits accrue to the wealthiest, best connected, and most consolidated players. This creates both an opening for workers to organize and make demands for a bigger piece of a growing pie, and of course more pie available for the company to integrate or repress those demands, as their more central economic position gives them more access to political influence, as well as resources for demobilizing any workers' initiatives by compromising on or even fulfilling some demands. This shift in the garment manufacturing sector to becoming a higher value-added proposition, which is a trend that has been observed in, for example, China for more than a decade now, has not necessarily, according to Ashok's fieldwork, been acknowledged by anti-sweatshop and global labor NGOs, who are still stuck in an earlier model of putting pressure on the buyers, so brands and consumers, even when it's clear that in many spaces, you mention 8 countries in the book, the last few years have seen an upswing in workers' shop floor initiatives, which could also be linked to the regulation introduced into a growing and expanding garment sector by a powerful workers' movement in the US in the first part of the 20th century. This is problematic for a few reasons, this lack of focus on the change in the situation by the NGOs. This is problematic for a few reasons, specifically the illusion of workers' agency by a savior mentality that sees them as disempowered victims, additionally disadvantaged by a largely female composition of many garment workforces. But also, of course, misrecognizing or not attending to the shifting balance of power and the new opportunities as well as challenges that they open up, with the opportunities including a swing away from transnational advocacy to on-the-ground organizing in factories. So everyone knows what the book is about by now, I would imagine, but just had to recapitulate the argument, which was not difficult as it's both substantial and concise, in order to get to my questions. Now, I'm not really an expert in anything, to be fair, and anything I would focus on in the book will be more comprehensively explored by qualified people, and in many cases it already has. For instance, I might have done some writing individually and collaboratively on social reproduction, but I think Tithi has already posed many of the right questions in this arena, in general, but also on the panel. I guess what I will center my remarks on, then, is a fairly transversal approach to the question of value and how we encounter it in the book. We encounter it chiefly in terms of the metric applied by scholars of global political economy and industry analysis to the production and circulation of surplus value in the global value chain of garment manufacturing, primarily circulation, as Ashok underlined, which is to say, as a neutral term that is largely conflated with profits, as a standard in orthodox economic accounts. Conversely, though Ashok does not offer an alternative account of this both specialized and mainstream concept of value, what he does offer is an account of value relations that is political, with labor politics as the chief optic. So although Ashok doesn't employ a technical Marxist understanding of value, and I would almost say there's no reason why he should, because that's not exactly of primary relevance to what the book is interested in, although, as David mentioned, it might still be helpful. Yes. So I'll spend the rest of my time developing two questions, one around value and one that poses a challenge to the book's central thesis, although it's a challenge I have every confidence Ashok will be able to meet. So it's one of those questions that is more an opportunity to get some further education. With regard to value, I've always been interested in what Marx and many others have discussed as the social and moral element of the value of labor power, which is to say, its conditions of reproduction. A large part of that, as many commentators, particularly in the eco-feminist, Marxist-feminist, and political ecology fields have pursued, as is germane to the core topic of this year's conference, is the outside to value which constitutes value. In other words, what does the commodity contain which is not waged or priced? What does wage labor, commodified labor, contain that is not commodified? I've always subscribed to the view that we can only understand the form of value in its historical and social instantiation as value relations, through following what it systematically leaves out, which points to my critical formation through the reading of Italian autonomist feminists, and in recent years, theorists of blackness, indigeneity, and systems ecology. The question does not stop with just what social processes are not reckoned or reflected in value as it filters down to the formal wage. And here I absolutely follow Tithi in her contention that all struggles on the side of production are at the same time reproductive struggles. But what value production is predicated on, but which it must expel, chiefly as waste, externality, or also crime, when it comes to labor discipline and the rendering surplus of populations. The form of value is the nucleus of social abstraction, inasmuch as it renders everything exchangeable, either through the abstraction of labor as a homogeneous quantity, or the exclusion-generating mechanisms of rent, or the speculative vortices of financialization. And in all cases, money is the measure of this process, which renders socially effective and dominant, the equivalence established by the form of value. Now clearly, any workers' organizing that is described in this book is going to be unfolding on a terrain structured by value relations, and the relative balance of power will fluctuate within the parameters of those relations. Acknowledging this is in many ways tantamount to adopting the neutral, non-technical notion of value we see in the labor process analysis that brought us the global value chain metric. But the question may still be asked, if the value composition is shifting, with constant capital on the rise and organic composition, if not stagnant, then certainly not booming and maybe even shrinking in the garment sector, then we can see equivocal but not entirely depressing outcomes for the workers there. However, if the value composition starts to shift more drastically, having to price in untold escalations in the cost of energy, for example, as areas in the global south undergo some of the more drastic consequences of climate breakdown, as we were just seeing in Mumbai, what will happen to workers' bargaining power then, along with the rest of the formal economy? So that's one interesting thing to consider. One possible scenario, of course, is that brands will decline to absorb the added costs, preferring to limit their outgoings in production by insourcing back to Europe, or its less prosperous parts at any rate, something which has already been happening on a small scale, albeit not so much in the garment sector, given the sector's relative position on the value-added curve. So that's one possible scenario in terms of the value composition of the garment sector, a very schematic one, of course. Another is the more direct unbalancing of the value relation thanks to automation and the good old falling rate of profit that accompanies growing investments in fixed capital, which all of the factories the book looks at are engaged in doing and making. Certainly at this stage of the value-added curve, they cannot claim to be squeezing value out of anything but surplus labor. So naturally, once there's more machines and fewer workers, this will be a problem, both for the profits and the prospects of workers organizing, especially as management impresses constantly on the workers how replaceable they are, because competition for jobs will only grow more relentless once a lot of those jobs are automated, with educational and other drivers of social mobility changing much more slowly than technology. So to finish up. Now with technology, this brings me to my final question. Given the book's very concrete and plausible narrative of improved prospects for worker organizing in large industrial enterprises rather than fly-by-night and relatively informal sweatshops, I would only pose the obvious question of a very different industry, and maybe give Ashok a chance to discuss the differences, which is indeed operating at a huge scale, but has very little to no tendencies of independent workers organizing to speak of, contrary to the footwear factory UUN, and that, of course, is Foxconn. I'd be interested to hear Ashok say more about how consolidation in the electronics sector works differently from consolidation in the garment sector, and maybe what you see as the more general political economic implications we can pick up from that. So here we might face another value question, which is the one of how value is distributed across different industrial sectors in relation to state incentives and market constraints, and given the close imbrication of large transnationally linked firms with domestic and foreign capital investors and banks, and hence with nation states. And that's something I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on in general, starting from the garment sector, and how that influences the prospects for worker organizing. Since, as we know, the more financialized capitalism gets, the harder it is for workers to take the initiative. And though we're talking about productive capital here, as it were, with the garment factories, it'd be interesting to hear more about the relationship to finance, or what Bob Jessup would call distinctively political capitalism, to indicate the specific implication of finance capitalism in the States. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to give Ashok a little bit of time to respond to this, and then we'll open up to questions. But we've had a lot, so I thought we'd give him a chance.
Thank you very much for the comments. I'm gonna just really quickly, the acronyms thing, yes. I was engaging mostly with a lot of value chain literature. If you do read the book, just treat them as supply chains. Because you're engaging with that literature, it was, I didn't want to trip up. So, but yeah, I mean, it's still in the final proof, so I can maybe change those or add an index. I think, I didn't get to talk about the MFA much, but the multi-fiber agreement, basically it was a 30-year agreement that set quota limits for global north countries from global south countries. It was negotiated primarily by global north unions. And what it did was it forced factories to be produced in the far-flung corners of the globe, which then puts limits on the possibilities of maximizing profits because it's a form of global regulation. That's the best way to see it. Once that ends, then you see this kind of the possibilities of both consolidation, but also increased monopsony power and then consolidation. I think that on Tithi's point, I think there's a lot of people who've done, really great work on the question of gender that I use in the garment sector that I use. Particularly Jane Wills and Jane Collins, Gay Simon at Wisconsin. And I think that if you look at the garment sector, women are the ones that sew, cut, and press, clean, while men are the ones who design it. Women operate machines that men service. Women work on the factory floor, while men stand guard. But the wage differentials are pretty substantial. And so this brings to the question, I talk a little bit about it, about the questions of how skill is circumscribed and the limits of skill in the sector. Actually, I just learned that the person that I was, the investigator that I first discussed is actually Tithi's brother-in-law, which is like, it's a small world and it is a very tiny left. Just in case, anyone didn't think that already. But also on the question of reproduction, it's not just at the point of production, but at the point of consumption. And one of the arguments that I tried to make about the growth of Arvind, for example, was that their success, basically Arvind was formed around the independence movement in which there was an encouragement to produce and sell produce clothing indigenously in India. And it was one of the thousands of small firms that opened up. It really broke out in the sort of 1980s with the denim revolution, because what they did was they created this thing called ready-to-stitch jeans. But people were already suspicious of buying trousers at a shop in the 70s and 80s, really in the 80s. So they did this ready-to-stitch, which effectively transferred the labor process to the consumer, and that consumer was women in the home. So it was not just that there was social reproduction happening and exploiting social reproduction at the point of production, but also at the point of consumption. but also that this also changes the strategies of trade unions because of the changing composition. I mean, it's different. Like you go to North India, certain parts of Gurgaon and Noida, it's primarily men who work in the sector, but mostly in the sector it's about 85 to 90% women. In the South, it's almost entirely women. And what that did is shift the organizing strategies of trade unions that primarily, didn't talk about issues that affected women around sexual harassment or issues affecting around having a crash or other issues that arrive that the trade unions were now refocusing their energies. And so, it plays an integral part of both the forms of exploitation but also forms of organization and resistance. I think on the point of the questions around ethical organizing, I think one of the big problems we see in the sector, and it's just kind of shocking actually when you think about all the organizations and we have a whole center in the university I work in that just churns out papers about like corporate social responsibility, and you're just like I thought it was dead, but it's not. It's like thriving. But if you look at the evidence shows that in the last 20, 30 years of all these efforts, and just the number of efforts that have been used, stakeholder agreements, etc., they've all failed. Every single one of them have failed. The only successful examples of when it's succeeded, and I've identified a couple of them, is when the material conditions change, so vertical integration, etc. And so, for example, the Jerseys de Honduras case of Russell Athletic and Fruit of the Loom, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, and their vertical integration changed the possibilities for workers to make greater demands. So then they went on strike. They shut down the workplace. There was an international solidarity campaign. It cost the company about £50 million in lost profits from boycotts alone in the first 6 months. And it forced them to the table. So it's both attacks at the point of production, changing material conditions, attacks at the point of consumption, and that's what wins it for workers. None of these other initiatives, all of them, are basically trash. So I think that's the argument. It's not just an opinion. It's borne out in the empirical evidence. And that's why it's so quite surprising that this stuff still goes on and people still talk about this. It's not like it's both ideological than saying this, but it's also that it's like actually borne out in the evidence. On the question of participatory transnational, so basically there's a section where we talk about when you saw the European model, where the sort of European social model, in which workers had a seat at the table, and there were sort of forms of there was a greater ability for workers to negotiate directly. What you had was, and there's a really brilliant book about on this called Global Union Local Power by Jamie McCallum, where he talks about actually that when sort of neoliberalism hits in the U.S., you already have lots of workplaces that are antagonistic. You have a retrenched welfare. You don't really have a welfare state, but you have a retrenched state. So when it hits, it doesn't really hit the same way it hits other European countries. And so when that happens, the way that these unions, and I'm talking about the ITG, which represented unions in the sector, in the garment, footwear sectors and textile sectors, become globalized under industrial, they try to apply the same sort of principles. So they have these things called global or international framework agreements. Again, in labor-intensive, low-value sectors that are vertically disintegrated, there is no evidence that it's been successful. But they just sort of transplanted that from a domestic strategy to a global strategy. And it didn't work. But what did work to some extent was what I call participatory transnationalism, which was based on the generally antagonistic relationship that you had with workers in the sector in the US that was constantly trying to outrun capital and force them to the table, rather than having the expectation that they were already on the table because of a class compromise from 50 years ago. That what that meant was that for the first 10, 15 years there were campaigns around it, but ultimately it ended up being fairly unsuccessful. But it's they're still, that is the legacy of the state structure onto the transnational structure. But in lieu of a state, it's very difficult. In lieu of a sort of international state and a global race to the bottom, it's hard to imagine that states can regulate. Look, for example, I give the example of Sri Lanka. For example, Sri Lanka in 1997, they were one of the first in South Asia and in Asia more generally to introduce SEZs, special economic zones. They then, by 1997, have a kind of center-left party that comes in that says we're going to introduce higher wages, within a week of coming into office that they've introduced the bill, they then pull it back because of that, they're sort of forced to, because these companies say they're going to go. I mean, we know this story. It's a familiar story. So that the idea that a state, every time a state has attempted to do it, you always either have, and there's really great research by Mark Anner on this that consistently shows that that's what happens. Not that we need evidence for that, but that's the evidence. I think, what was the question of value, insourcing? Yes. So on the question of where capital might go now, I mean, I think I said this a little bit when I was introducing it, but yes, I mean, basically in the tail end of writing this, I was just like, global warming, what's the point? But I was like, I can't, obviously I can't, I don't have much to add to that, but I would say that on the question of insourcing, you do see that happening with low fashion-sensitive sectors. You do see high automation directly invested by the brand, like with footwear, for example, which is the most valorizable of the sector. And then so you do see changes. It's not that you all of a sudden have the symbiosis. And I mean, capital is a wily one. So I'm not suggesting that there isn't going to be ways that they will shift, but for now, it seems that in certain sectors, in certain parts of the world, things are changing.
Great. So, we're going to clap. Getting so much applause. Okay, questions, comments, reflections?
Okay, thank you so much. I have two brief questions. The first question I want to consult with you about the global supply chain and how it makes the class struggle has shifted into the class struggle between workers and subcontracts, rather than the Western brands, like in the Foxconn worker protester, the worker who are it's basically the struggle between the workers and the Foxconn, not the workers with the Apple company, but Apple and also Nike. So those Western brands, they extract the most of the value. So this is the first question. The second question is about global supply chain. I want to bring the work of Anna Kim. She talks about the global supply chain is based on not based on the homogeneous global capitalism. Rather, she talks about how differences it can mobilize within the global supply chain. So it's niche-based global capitalism. But I think in your narrative, you are more like to think of like a emerging global class, worker class movement or something like that. So I feel you are more based on how homogeneous global capitalism is based on. So could you have a conversation with her work? Thank you.
I go?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have if I haven't read the book, so it's difficult to make questions and comments about the book that I haven't read it. But if I understood correctly the concept of monopsony, it reminds me a lot how the fisher sector works in Portugal and how the fishing sector is organized. You actually have a lot of producers, a lot of fishermen who have to sell their fish for just one buyer. And so they have to bargain among them who's going to lower the price the more they can. So the way you develop your concept is through the process of people who are selling their labor force. Okay, so I would like to question if we could apply your strategy in the way you think monopsony to this level of producers, of small producers who are like individual producers, like fishermen who have their own boats and are selling their products of their work to just one buyer. And I say this because I think what Catarina said is probably the hardest question, but also the most important. That is the paper that the state has in all this organization of not just the creation of I'm losing my English. Sorry. Okay, so starting again. what Catarina said about the importance of the presence of the state and how we could organize, and the dimension of the power of the state, and how we can think about how the state works. Because in the case of fishermen in Portugal, they have lost, they are always losing bargaining power, even when they become more organized. So all the experience we have in Portugal of organized fishermen, it always resulted in their losing of their capacity of struggle. So I would like to ask you if it's possible to apply this to like single producers.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would like to add is together Tithi comment and Catarina again comment on the state, is that in case of it hurts me a lot just to talk about Juarez, sorry, because it's not just Juarez, it's the entire Mexico state right now. So it's how the Juarez was a project, an experiment that was not just based on the difference of gender, but also reorganization of the space. You know, in Juarez, the city and the factories are placed in the indigenous camps where women have to move to the city, and they have a long space, they have to move around. And so that also fragilized their capacity for organization. And for a long time, women have tried to unionize in las maquilladoras in the north of Mexico. They always failed because the state was always complicit with the violence. So that's why in Mexico we don't talk about femicide, we talk about feminicide, because it's how the state is part of the organization of the gender violence and how it legitimates that gender violence that is used for the purpose of capital accumulation. And that is now is generalized in Mexico, and it's felt in all stages in rates that are totally inhumane. So that's just the two comments I want to make.
So, yeah, my question is very brief. If there is a tendency of the degree of monopsony to increase in the garment industry, how is this affecting the rate of profit when it comes to fashion brands, retail prices, or the mass of clothes that is produced?
Yeah.
And yeah, the question is whether you have tested your thesis against these variables.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we'll do two more, and then we'll let you go.
Keep it brief. So the question is basically, what are the implications for other sectors? Because garment sector is quite specific in the concrete labor and product. So does your model and argument apply to other sectors, and to what extent? And I'm thinking particularly of the rise of the platform model as a market-leading model of the firm, and the sort of digital capacity that it is. Like, I think is the implication of that from an upside.
Cool.
Yeah, one observation, very quick observation, and one question. I noticed that there's massive similarities between the situation in the textile industry in the 19th century in Lancashire and Dundee and other places thereabouts, but huge cultural differences from the situation we find in, for example, China or Bangladesh. The second question is about the international, well, this is the first question actually. The question is about the international dimension. I noticed in the trade union movement in this country considerable solidarity action with the textile workers in Bangladesh.
What do you mean by cultural difference?
Sorry?
What do you mean by cultural difference between...
Well, for example, in the subcontinent, there's a caste system in the history that may affect the gender...
Which part of the subcontinent has caste?
Oh, well, India.
Okay. He's talking about Bangladesh, Sri Lanka.
No, but originally it was... I don't know. The international question then. I noticed lots of solidarity movements in the British trade union movement with the textile workers in Bangladesh. Not so much aware of it in other places, but also if you go to China, there was fast food industry strike, massive fast food industry strike, where the workers there, unofficial of course, where the workers there formed links with the American McDonald's strikers. So I wondered if someone would like to comment about this international dimension.
Okay, really quickly on that, I think that, I'm less focused on, and this goes to the question about local. Look, I'm not a post-colonial theorist. I'm a Marxist, and Marx, as aptly says and has always been reproduced about workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, and what he means by that is workers everywhere don't want to be in chains. It's not like, oh, maybe these workers like to be in chains. Workers everywhere do not want to be in chains, right? And that desire is a human desire, and that's why I'm talking about a global story of workers everywhere, given the conditions, will struggle, whether it's from Lancashire to Bangladesh or China. There isn't some cultural reason, and there's no cultural reason why people would want to be oppressed and exploited. And so that's basically the story here. It's that everywhere what we see consistently is workers organizing and demanding greater wages when they get the chance to do that. But the textile industry is a bit different. Textile industry is far more standardized, far more vertically integrated, far higher organic composition of capital. So I think it's a bit of a different story. And the question of, I'll just take it backwards, then the question of how this relates to other sectors, I don't see why it wouldn't. The monopsony relationship would be the same. If you have a high degree of monopsony power, you're going to have more downward pressure. You're going to have a higher share of value captured by the buyer, if it is the high degree of monopsony power. The garment sector is a helpful sector because it's been fairly unchanged for 100 years. The only thing that's changed is the degree of monopsony power. So it's a good way of studying over a long period of time how this has changed and how those changes have reflected in the distribution of value. I didn't answer a question earlier, but there was a Foxconn-related thing that Marina said, and the question was asked. In terms of Foxconn, Foxconn is the exclusive producer for Apple. What you see in Foxconn, like the distribution of value for Foxconn workers in China, it's in the PRD, the Pearl River Delta region, it's higher than garment workers. If you look at workers who work in more technologically higher technological investment at the point of production, investment in size matters, especially if that size is in relation to the buyer. So they do have higher wages and higher bargaining power than garment workers. That's a fact. There's also the fact that as the wages, we have year-on-year wage increases in China from basically 2007 to, in real terms, about 12.5% till 2015. That's the reason Foxconn's opening up this facility in Brazil. That's the reason Foxconn's opening a facility in Vietnam. That's the reason Foxconn's negotiating a massive factory in Wisconsin. And that's the reason. The reason is because, their bargaining power has changed, and the distribution of value to the workers has changed. And I think that's poses an existential threat to companies like Apple if they continue to just rely on Foxconn. That's what I mean. I don't think that they could continue relying on one. But the reason you can't have other Foxconns is because they both, in terms of size, in terms of access to intellectual property, in terms of investment at the point of production, makes it very hard for other competitors, and it increases the barriers to entry. I think on the question of rate of profit, well, you're producing more efficiently when you have more investment at the point of production in labor-saving technology in the short term, but then that also means that, so you're having greater value being captured at the point of production and at the point of consumption up until a certain point. And then when that happens, the rate of profit will probably fall. So it's just a tendency. Oh yeah, on the pink tide. Sorry, I didn't answer that earlier. Well, I don't know how much the pink tide had an effect on it. I mean, that depends on what your position on the pink tide is. But I think that most of the maquilas were in. Obviously maquilas are in Mexico. Most of the production for the U.S. were from Mexico. Mexico wasn't affected by the pink tide. There was very little production in Bolivia and Venezuela. So I don't really see the connection. I see a connection between, the rates of exploitation and the ability to exploit at a greater rate in Asia, and that basically is the driver of the move of capital.
Thank
Imperialism.
Don't whisper it!
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell more about this monopoly? You know, this monopoly power is not really defining anything, isn't it? Except they hold on the market, which makes them trade powers. So they are not, you know, they are not, in the sense, a productive monopoly. They are actually merchant capital who are having great power on the trading into the Western markets, and monopoly capitalism, monopoly power in that sense is that supply chain that you name that's the point of production, isn't it? Like in reality, what you call monopoly power is just the merchant capitalist who is distributing all these things to the markets. And does he have any power, for example, in relation to credit capital? You know, does he have any autonomy, political autonomy, or, you know, by being a monopoly in that sense?
Okay.
Thank you. My question was, the title of the book makes some relation or not with the idea of monopoly capitalism. And in this sense, you use a lot the word power for the relation between capital, and but at the same time you put the emphasis on the value, and you said, I don't want to talk about the production of value, but separating the circulation of value and the production is problematic. And in your own explication of the problem, you said that in the monopsony there is competition and they are changing technologically, so there's no stagnation. So what means this relation of power? And in political terms, I think it's also complicated, because maybe not in all the countries, but I think it's quite all the world of global south, how they call it here. You found political regulation in this sense when you see that the problem is the power. So in some sense, it goes through the alliances between the working class and the local capitals, because they are both exploited by the power. So in this sense, you were talking about the union of the working class, but if you think in power's terms, the relation, how it deals with all these populist movements and nationalistic movements that make that propose an alliance with these capitals because they are both exploited.
Hi, so my question actually builds on Juan's question and on your question as well, and on a question that was related to profit rates, because it wasn't clear to me if in your book you actually calculate the evolution of profit rates between these like different stages within the supply chain. Because it may be possible that actually it's not that the branding companies are diminishing their profit rate, but actually what's going on is that the garment companies are diminishing their profit rate after the struggles of the workers within those companies. So if that's the case, ultimately my question would be, where does this monopsony power come from? I think that's the relevant question, because it's pretty obvious that capitals have differentiated themselves, and it's not the same to be a garment company in Bangladesh than being Nike, and it's not the same to be Foxconn than being Apple. And also, it builds on the other questions, because actually, if we just say that it's because there is one buyer on one side and many on the other, when the other side concentrates, as it's the case of your UN company or also Foxconn, the explanation becomes weaker. Especially if, and that's why my question also goes to the calculation of profit rates, especially if this moment when the seller becomes more concentrated is not correlated with a higher profit rate for that seller.
Okay, let's take your question.
Yeah, firstly, thanks very much for all the contributions, actually. And just how much I welcome somebody. I've spent years looking at questions in the past, actually, questions of globalization and so on. But it's really good to have that sort of detailed analysis, and you've made me really think about my old perception of there just being monopsony. In other words, the brands being completely dominant in terms of the value chains. And so this idea that you're seeing changes, I think you suggested something like oligopolistic structures on both sides of the supply chain, that to me is a real revelation, actually, and I really look forward to following that up. I also wanted to come back, I was going to ask again about the Foxconn question, which you partly answered, but I'm not sure that your answer was actually entirely satisfactory in the sense that there is a limit to the mobility of capital when you've got that degree of investment in fixed capital.
Yeah.
And I think David Harvey's made this point at various stages, perhaps would like to comment. And from what I understand, without being in any sense having exact figures in my head, but I gather the investment that Foxconn has made in its massive factories in China is such that they're not simply going to give that up. I mean, they may be expanding and new investment may be going elsewhere, but they can't simply walk away in a way in which you can walk away if you've got, and nor can Apple walk away. Whereas you can, if you're as I understood it at least, if you're you're a garment seller, the buyer, you can simply switch. It's much easier to switch your supplier from one country to another.
Technology and space. Technology and space. The argument is that they exist inversely in this relationship. That you have, the greater you have the investment at the point of production, the more limits you have on space. And we see this over and over again across sectors. So let's take Foxconn, for example. If workers take action at Foxconn, if workers withdraw their labor power at Foxconn, it's harder to replace them. And Beverly Silver's written about this quite extensively, based on David's work. And so, I guess, on the question of on monopoly, it's based on a kind of Kaleckian idea of degree of monopoly, and that's what I apply to monopsony. I'm not taking monopoly as having a single firm having power over prices, etc. I'm talking about it in terms of the relationship they have both horizontally and vertically. First, horizontally, right? What is their relationship relative? So if you move from high competition toward, if there's a spectrum of high competition and monopoly, it's moving from high competition closer to monopoly. And that's the argument. It's not making an argument around, I'm not making an argument about their power, their political power, or the kind of Bear and Sweezy arguments around prices or political power. I'm making an argument about their relationship vis-a-vis competition and monopoly. In terms of profit rates, if we look at it, I look at rates of profit over the course of the last really 20, 30 years. And as you have, as the MFA ends, the rates of profit, distribution of, let's just call it distribution of value for the sake of, rather than rates of profit. Distribution of value that happened, that goes to the consumer, or to the brand, spikes. So their profits actually increase exponentially. But then by the time we reach 2009, 2010, what we see is their profit rates are still really high, but you're also seeing higher rates of profit through consolidation, because now you're having, what Applebaum calls supply chain cities. So you're able to design and function, do all these things, or an organizational fix, do all these things very efficiently rather than inefficiently moving them around, building tighter and tighter networks. Those networks then mean that, for example, Po Yuan, which owns UUN, their rates of profit are so high in 2014 when the strike happened that they were making more, their profit rate year on year was higher than all of their suppliers, all of the brands that they were producing for, other than Nike and Adidas. And Nike and Adidas, of course, own 60% of the sports and apparel ways, or their subsidiaries. But all the other ones, Timberland, etc., they were making higher profit rates. That's unprecedented. So that once you're, in terms of profit rates, what we know is that they did change. And the argument I'm making is that's because of the degree of competition fell and the degree of monopoly went up. And the degree of monopsony went down. Does that make sense? Huh? No, I'm not going to invite follow-up, sorry.
Okay, so just a quick announcement. If you want more of David and Ashok, then the panel that they'll be on next is going to be moved to here instead of where it was.
Oh,
so
good idea.
that's good if you want to sit around for ages and ages and ages. Pardon? Yeah, it's good. So the panel, what's it called? It's
Marx's double-edged law.
Marx's double-edged law. That panel is going to be in here instead of in B202. Thanks very much to our speakers. Thanks very much for questions. Thanks very much for
I think, which I didn't
Acho que era Furby or left or right. Okay. Right. Lovely.
What is the